Well, we're doing a principles only show, and we thought again sometimes our backstage conversations are more interesting than the on stage ones. I'm about to
Yes.
say, because we've got a vast amount of information and experience, which one assumes other people know, but they don't. So what I'm talking about, what I was talking just before the show, is that was things about Scandinavia, which Danes and Swedes know, but outsiders don't know, even a very well-educated ones such as yourself. And you probably find the same. You probably tell things about, I don't know, South Dakota and Wyoming that's incredibly interesting, but we just don't know. So you asking me, well, you tell me what you want to find out about Denmark versus Sweden, and I'll tell you.
Well, when you say North Dakota and Wyoming, for me, it's more like New Jersey and Delaware, but it's the same principle. But
Yeah.
I've always adored Sweden, Denmark, and I've always felt, however long I was there, it was never long enough. But I haven't been back there in ages,
Yeah.
and I remember it the way you described it, but I hope you describe it now to our viewers, which is rather like a more polite, classier version of the way the Republic of Ireland was in the 1970s. Ireland, the last 30 years, has been tremendously classy, but it came up fast once we joined the European Union, I think in 1973. And the way, for me, Denmark has always been, friendly people, lots of wonderful lager, great parties, great restaurants, smorgasbords everywhere, fabulous butter, fabulous cheese, fabulous meats. But you're telling me that now it is chic, sophisticated
Yeah.
as well. Please
Yeah.
go on.
Well, I mean, I think that as I said, Sweden is a more straight-laced version and more and in a way more primitive. I mean, it's less central to Europe. It was Denmark is more continental. I mean, it's part of the European plain that stretches across from Poland to Holland. So Denmark is in some respects quite similar to Holland, and you feel that you're in a totally different intellectual and social, environmental climate. Where Sweden is a lot of forest in Sweden, and then the Swedes are more of a work ethic, perhaps more straight-laced. So Swedes in the 1970s and 80s used to go to Denmark for the weekends and drink a lot, because you could buy super beer in shops. Denmark's famous for Carlsberg and Tuborg. And as soon as you arrived on the hydrofoil from straight-laced Malmo, you could literally dive into cellar in Copenhagen, in the Nyhavn, the new harbor area, and sit and drink bottles of beer, delicious beer. And probably the best beer in the world was Carlsberg's slogan. And it's I think in the 1970s and 80s when I first got to know Denmark, and the Denmark that you're probably referring to, it had a slightly down at heel feel.
Yes.
It wasn't as rich as Sweden was, and they weren't as work disciplined. And there was a very strong peace movement, which is a good thing. The men didn't care about their appearance so much. They said they looked like Greenpeace activists, whereas Swedish Danish women were always very beautiful, and they still are beautiful. So there was
Oh,
also
I'm
this
glad to hear
mismatch.
that.
So it's a
Yeah.
place where Englishmen went and tried to get the girls on their English culture because they didn't think the men were much of a competition. They looked as if they just come back from protesting against a whale killing them or something. You know, just got off the rubber dinghy or something. That was the Danish mail, and they were very into peace. And so Denmark was loose, relaxed, freer. I mean, they had incredible varieties of pornography, apparently. Um, and Sweden did for a while then, but the feminist revolution hit Sweden much earlier and was much stronger. But I think, I'm saying this in the context of what I was telling you before the show, was that it was my mum's 85th birthday. She's an artist. She lives in Malmo, which used to be Danish, incidentally. And there's some Danish culture there still, but she goes across, she loves Copenhagen. So we went across to Copenhagen. We went to visited one of the modern art galleries. And I'm living in rural Sweden, which is a place where for fun, people still drive old American cars from the 50s and 60s and wear cowboy hats. There's still this fascination for America, not very sophisticated at all. And a lot of forest and a lot of farmland and miles away from the cosmopolitan world. Like Copenhagen is totally different, one of the most chic cities in Europe. And I think, and it was great fun. And we went to Modern Art Gallery, set among the sand dunes south of Copenhagen with a beautiful view of the Baltic Sea and all these huge glass spaces. And then this modern art, which was rather it's always done for effect, to shock the viewer. And my mum comes from an advertising background, so she likes these things, boxes with slogans on them rather than sort of classical paintings, and that's fine, part of the experience. But um, I think that the girls were incredibly chic still, very well dressed, and the men too, very metrosexual. And I think that Denmark has changed. I mean, Denmark's become much more expensive than Sweden. The Danish krona is one of the most powerful currencies in Europe. Denmark is one of the richest countries in Europe, but it used to be not very rich. And they've still got the largest number of Michelin restaurants per capita in the world. I think Noma or something is Europe's top restaurant. And it's all, as you said, it's a lot of fish, a lot of herring, a lot of smørrebrød, a lot of buffets. And I think that the Danes have become uh, more, I think, prosperity, more less interesting in some ways. Little bit more pretentious, perhaps. So they've shunned the beer cellar for the elegant restaurant, and they've become very anti-Muslim, and I don't think and they're very very anti-Russian. So whereas before in the 1970s and 80s they were like there was a because they were occupied in one day in 1940. So they used to have this thing. The joke was that the Danish didn't have a military. They had an answer phone with a message in Russian. Please, if after hours, please call this number when you want to invade the country. you know. And I remember playing war games, Avalon Hill war games, where the Danes had a zero combat ability. I mean, they were basically lost every single firefight with everyone. And I thought that was quite charming. They were very, very anti-militaristic, and they realized they didn't, unlike the Swedes, for instance, had quite a well-developed military with forest cavernous bases, and they used the runways, motorways in Sweden as runways and things like that. So they've still got a big military industry like Gripen and Ericsson. I mean, Saab, British Aerospace, but Denmark had none of that, and they had mostly food, and they were quite phlegmatic. But now they are Mette Frederiksen, who's the Danish prime minister, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was a Danish prime minister and now is like a chief lobbyist for Zelensky, and they're talking up this inevitability of war with Russia, and they're really talking big words, and it worries me. It makes me wonder because the Danes might have a slightly stronger military than they used to, but they're practically defenseless. I mean, it's a dead flat country. The highest elevation in Denmark is 87 meters above sea level, and they call it Heavenly Mountain, believe it or not. But otherwise, it's like Holland. It's a very flat country. It could easily be occupied by the Russian paratroopers, and yet they are doing very provocative things. I mean, they're talking big words against the Russians more than anyone else, perhaps except possibly the Poles, the Balts. And this comes from a country with a very pacifist tradition. And I just wonder what happened. And they're also very close to the Americans. They also signed up to all the American wars in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. And that's what I that's why I was like the only person in Scandinavia who welcomed the American talk about annexing Greenland, because I thought finally somebody takes down the Danes a peg. Somebody gives them some Valium, because they're hyperactive and they say we with the Americans are gonna defeat the Russians. And when it turns out the Americans are not only not going to support them, but actually going to take what constitutes 99% of Danish territory, I thought, well, that's a reality check for you. It's like that saying, the sheep spends his whole life fearing the wolf, but gets eaten by the shepherd. Something like that. So America was it was a corrective. That was the main reason I thought the Danes will shut up now. But instead, they said, well, no, we'll take on the Americans and the Russians using the European army. So that was a thing. They sent a little tripwire army to Greenland in January. So I don't know what's up with the Danes. I mean, I don't recognize them anymore. And I speak as someone who I spent a few years of my childhood in Sweden, when my parents divorced. And you had one Danish TV channel and two Swedish TV channels. We watched almost more Danish TV, so I could understand the language. It's very close to Swedish anyway. And if you're part of Denmark for most of your history is the current province I was in, Skåne, then Denmark feels like a natural home. So the Danes feel like our people, whereas the Stockholmers don't feel like our people. So, but now I don't understand the Danes. I think there's a lot of arrogance about the Danes, a lack of reality, a bit of pretentiousness. I'm wondering whether you've had the same experience about the Irish, because the Irish image. I mean, they're now the richest country in Europe, aren't they? And they've seemed to have abandoned a lot of they're not Catholic anymore. They're turning woke, aren't they? And they're turning elegant. They've got money. Well, what do you think?
I agree completely, because the way you're describing the relative nature of Sweden, looking at Denmark in the past, and the more than slightly prudish attitude towards those far too easygoing Danes. Well, in Scandinavia, at least up to now, yeah, I think the ancient rivalries between Sweden and Denmark from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance seem to be safely buried along with King Gustavus Adolphus. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah.
that is my optimistic sense. And of course, in Ireland, at least up to very recently, we haven't had that. The 17th century has been alive and well in Northern Ireland, especially, all too much so. But your attitude is absolutely right. I come from Belfast, and my dad was a Cork man from the Irish Republic, and my mum was a lifelong unionist. And the Irish fought around down the middle of the bedroom for them. It was the one issue in 35 years of marriage that they never, not only could they not resolve, they never tried to resolve it. This was Ireland. You were what you were. You could coexist or even marry people from the other side of the border, the other side of the great sectarian divide, but you had to stay what you were. And if you didn't, people on both sides of the divide would distrust you because they'd reckon, oh, you're not being authentically Irish anymore. You're not being a good loyal unionist anymore, you know? In Ireland in those days, happily, it seems to be very different now, but both North and South in those days, things had to be binary, they had to be simple. But even down to the excellence of the agricultural products, Ireland in that sense was like Denmark. And as you say, we're much more prosperous. Sectarian Protestant Catholic violence is, thank God, a pale shadow of what it was in the 1970s and the early 1980s, virtually gone. And and Ireland, both North and South, have prospered by being in the European Union. Northern Ireland today, and I think you are the one who got me these figures, is the most prosperous part of the United Kingdom,
Mm.
which floored me. And the reason it is that, of course, with the cunning that the Southern Irish are always accused of by the North, but the Northerners happily are perfectly capable of too. Uh, it finally dawned on people in the North, again on both sides, that being in the European Union and making peace was very good policy
Mm.
for the people of Northern Ireland, wherever you came from. And you got the advantages of being in the European Union, and you got the advantages of being in the United Kingdom at the same time.
Mm.
So we have been laughing while successive Conservative and Labour governments in Britain, as you well know, have blundered from one economic fiasco and catastrophe to another. I mean, what's one of the great themes of our show? That nobody in London, nobody in the Palace of Westminster, nobody in British politics knows what they're doing. Let's cross our fingers for Andy Burnham. I mean, I
Mm.
think the policies he'll swallow are as bad as everybody else's, but at least he ran Manchester for
Mm.
the first time in God knows how long. Britain's going to have a prime minister that did things,
Mm.
but the parallel is very strong. But we paid a price for it, a subtle price,
Mm.
and maybe it'll be worse than subtle. First, Ireland is like Denmark, like you describe it. It's much less interesting than it was. We're
Mm.
not outrageous anymore. There are flashes of the old dazzling, scathing wit, but most of it is gone.
Mm.
Even the old Irish Republicans are now one world, George Soros, free trade. Isn't free trade wonderful? Chinese exports will solve all problems and lift all borders. Now, I'm not anti Chinese for a second, but I do believe that the Chinese are not cutting Europe and America's throats. We're cutting our own throats, as
Mm.
you know. We're
Mm.
cutting our own throats. And Ireland is part of that.
Mm.
And Ireland now follows the woke consensus in economics as much as liberal elites do in London, in
Mm.
Paris,
Mm.
and New York, and in LA. The
Mm.
same,
Mm.
the same. So
Mm.
we're losing not just our wit and our humor
Mm.
at home, we're also losing something you say is vanishing in Britain and Sweden as well, our intellectual diversity,
mm,
our willingness to think, a capability even to think outside the box. We're
mm,
losing that too. And
mm,
also, Ireland is increasingly following the path of Finland and Denmark,
mm,
tiny little countries which would be terribly vulnerable in any war,
mm,
all of a sudden becoming the most macho. The Irish aren't spoiling for a fight in the Middle East. They're quite sensible there. But
mm,
when it comes to Russia,
mm,
uh, the Irish public opinion rolls up the sleeves and says to the Russians, "Come and do your worst." Never a wise thing to say to any Russians,
mm,
individually or with national governments. Come on along and do your worst. We'll stand up to you.
mm,
Well, no, you shouldn't really. That's not a very wise
mm,
policy.
mm,
If I may, one last point, there was a once was a famous story, I think now forgotten even in Ireland. Back in 1905, there was a liberal revolution in Russia which failed.
mm,
For democracy, freedom of speech, parliaments, and all good things. And most of the people who were participating in it were genuinely sincere about that.
mm,
And the Tsar crushed it with the usual massive shedding of blood.
mm,
But he also had to grant a constitution,
mm,
which, being stupid and brutal, Nikolai II immediately broke.
mm,
But when he issued the constitution, there was a tiny newspaper down in County Cork called the Skibbereen Eagle. In the
mhm,
in the village, it was hardly more. It wasn't even a town really of Skibbereen,
mm,
and
mm,
they wrote an editorial about this.
mm,
And they said the editor wrote, "The Skibbereen Eagle welcomes the Tsar of all the Russias, granting of the blessings of constitutional government and liberty to the long-suffering peoples of the Russian Empire.
mm,
However, we also feel impelled to provide the following caveat." I am, of course, not quoting from memory. My memory is
yeah.
not up to it, but it should be on. It's worth looking up the exact language, which will be even more ornate and even more ridiculous and better. The Skibbereen Eagle serves solemn warning that if the Tsar of all the Russias reneges on his promise for constitutional government, the Skibbereen Eagle will be keeping its eye on him.
All right.
Now, there's
Good.
something to make the Tsar of all the Russias tremble.
That's
The
right.
Skibbereen Eagle is watching you, right? And when you talk about, Denmark strutting around and standing up to, the bad, contemptible Russians,
Mm,
and of
mm,
course, all my English liberal upper middle class friends who would faint if someone pricked a thumb and dripped a drop of blood in their
mm,
presence, we're
mm,
going to stand up to you, Vladimir Putin, and General, or is he now a marshal? Gerasimov, as chief of the Russian general staff. The Guardian is watching you.
mm, mm,
The Daily Telegraph is
mm,
watching
mm,
you.
mm,
Wow.
mm. Well, I was going to say about it's fun that, and I mean the Irish, I mean relatively modern times, of course, were very aware of the dark arts of the British deep state, in a way that Scandinavia wasn't. But now they're on side with NATO and MI6 and everything.
Oh
They're
yeah.
dancing to their tune with this Russian threat thing. So, aren't the older hands saying, why are we doing this? Because our great achievement, at least to create, we were aware, like very few people in the rest of the Anglo world. I mean, the Australians and Canadians are completely mentally colonized still, I'd say. But the Irish were a little bit more independent, and now that seems to have gone. And of course, I mean, it's worth somebody can probably write a paper somewhere on the rise and fall of Scandinavian stroke Irish neutrality, because that's one thing that united them. I mean, the Irish and the Scandinavian Swedes sent troops down to Congo. Both were very made friendships, I would say, in their joint UN expeditions, because often they were the two white countries that were really believed in the UN in Europe. Anyway. And now it's going towards and because Austria and Switzerland didn't have the UN tradition that the Irish and the Swedes did, but yeah. So no, it's interesting. Denmark, yeah, I definitely group Denmark with Ireland, and the old Denmark and the old Ireland were countries that I really liked. I felt very much at home as soon as I stepped into the Irish Republic. About 25 years ago. I thought, oh, maybe I could live here, because it's
Oh
only
yeah.
20 quid to get back to London and the beautiful underpopulated country. But anyway, I was just to sort of wind up. Well, I mean, the difference between, well, the Irish, I suppose, they could send ships out, or they could provide basing rights to the British if they're going to interdict Russian ships. Well, the Danes, of course, are sitting on top of the Danish Straits, and that has been a choke point just as much as the Dardanelles, is that what you call it, in Turkey, has been for centuries. So much of Russian traffic, if it leaves St. Petersburg, it's got to leave either the Öresund between Sweden and Denmark, or the Big Belt, which is between the island of Zealand and the island of Fyn. So there's no option there. And for centuries, the Danish state made its money by charging all foreign ships going in and out of the Baltic, whether they were Dutch traders bringing timber back to England and Holland, or vice versa. Anyway, so now I think that's a constant worry that I'm hearing, that they're going to board some Russian ship. And I think that's actually already happened. It's just that it hasn't reached the point where the Russians are retaliating yet. Anyway, now we're getting worryingly geopolitical, and I wanted to keep the tone of this light. So maybe we'll end this short comparison between Denmark and Ireland and those changing cultures here. Prosperity and Europeanization doesn't make things necessarily better, at least for us old romantics. Anything that you want to say, Martin?
Well, I had one brilliant idea, even when you were going geopolitical there, Pele, and that is you must come and just as all you asked, where did the Irish dissidents go? The old Irish neutralists, they all came to America. They all came to America. And so we have to get you over here too.
That's right.
Perhaps the one place in Europe you and I should go, and summon our friends, is Slovakia, and we should set up a neutrality institute, to try and reclaim Denmark and Ireland and Finland back to the ways of peace, prosperity, and not being invaded or colonized by either side. How about that?
Sounds great. Well, I look forward to it, Martin. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, and you, Pele.